Before the silk gowns and ambassadorial titles, before the whispered scandals and iconic photographs, there was a girl raised not by affection, but by formality. Edwina's childhood was gilded in appearance, yet hollow in substance. Born into immense wealth as the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Cassel, a German-born Jewish banker and one of the richest men in Europe, Edwina had privilege but not presence. Her mother died when Edwina was just 11. Her father, emotionally distant and later remarried, left her to be raised by nannies and governesses in cold, cavernous estates. She learned early how to be still, how to be proper, how to speak only when spoken to. But no one taught her how to feel. Her grandfather Cassel, though immensely loving in his own way, was a man of empire and figures. He left Edwina a vast inheritance, millions in today's currency, but also a legacy of isolation. Wealth, she quickly learned, was a substitute for closeness. After his death when she was 19, Edwina became the richest unmarried woman in Britain, but also one of the loneliest. Her debut into London society was dazzling on paper but emotionally jarring. Edwina entered rooms filled with champagne, diamonds, and forced laughter. She perfected the art of conversation, but rarely felt heard. Men desired her, women envied her, and none truly saw her. Behind closed doors, Edwina rebelled, not through tantrums but through subtle acts of disobedience. She read controversial literature, but corresponded with radicals, and showed a startling disregard for aristocratic decorum. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. When she met Louis Mountbatten, she wasn't smitten with love. She was intrigued by purpose. He was structured, ambitious, and came from a noble lineage that rivaled her own. But even their early letters hinted at something transactional in their courtship. Love was assumed, not explored. They were a match made for society columns, not for emotional refuge. Marriage didn't soothe her restlessness. In fact, it heightened it. Louis was frequently away at sea, chasing glory in naval battles and overseas postings. Edwina, meanwhile, wandered, not aimlessly, but emotionally. She began taking lovers, quietly at first, then brazenly, not out of malice but out of hunger, for affection, for conversation, for touch. She chose men from various backgrounds: artists, soldiers, writers, diplomats. Some were fleeting. Others carved deep, though temporary, spaces in her life. The press eventually caught wind of her lifestyle, but the Mountbattens, ever the master strategists, rebranded their marriage as modern. It was an open secret, carefully packaged as a progressive partnership. Yet beneath the diplomatic smiles, Edwina's soul continued to drift. What few knew was how deeply she craved meaning. She volunteered during the Blitz, not for spectacle but for connection. She treated wounded soldiers, changed bedpans, and held the hands of the dying. In those dark hospital wards, she found something London's palaces could never give her: honesty. But that darkness also mirrored something inside her. In private writings never meant for publication, Edwina described recurring dreams of drowning, not in water, but in velvet rooms and empty embraces. She feared being remembered only as a beautiful woman who never stood still. She once confessed to a confidant that her greatest fear wasn't scandal, it was being forgettable. The emotional chasm within her was perhaps most evident in her bond with her daughters. She loved them, fiercely, but struggled to express it in conventional maternal ways. Duty often overruled tenderness. Her daughter Patricia would later recall feeling protected but never known. All these fragments, abandonment, emotional suppression, the burden of wealth, wove together into a quiet storm. Edwina was a woman split in two, one half polished for society, the other drowning in silence. So when she arrived in India in 1947, something inside her shifted. The vastness of the land, the suffering of its people, the rawness of independence, all of it offered a mirror to her internal landscape. It was there, amidst the heat and tension, that she encountered Jawaharlal Nehru, not just as a leader, but as a man who, like her, bore the weight of history and solitude. The connection was instant. Some called it inappropriate. Others called it poetic. But for Edwina, it was a moment of clarity. She had spent her life performing love. With Nehru, for the first time, she simply felt it. Born Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley in 1901, she was heiress to a vast fortune, granddaughter to a British lord, and one of the most sought-after debutantes of her generation. The newspapers called her the richest girl in the empire, but it wasn't just wealth that made her shine, it was her allure. With wide, intelligent eyes and a fashion sense ahead of her time, Edwina wasn't just admired, she was envied. In 1922, she married Lord Louis Mountbatten, uncle to Prince Philip and a rising star in the British Royal Navy. Their wedding was the event of the year, attended by royalty, flooded with press coverage, and marked as the union between beauty and ambition. Together, they looked like a perfect pair. Edwina, the modern aristocrat with a restless spirit. Louis, the naval officer destined for greatness. As the wife of Mountbatten, Edwina quickly became one of the most photographed women in the world. She was elegant, cosmopolitan, and always in motion, attending balls, organizing fundraisers, and gracing the covers of magazines. Wherever she went, scandalous whispers followed, but never enough to stain her image. In the eyes of the public, she was untouchable. Then came 1947, and the Mountbattens were appointed as the last Viceroy and Vicereine of British India. For Edwina, it was more than a ceremonial role. Dressed in silk saris and adorned with pearls, she glided through Indian palaces with the grace of a born empress. Photos of her standing beside Mahatma Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru made headlines in both Britain and India. She became the face of imperial diplomacy, soft, persuasive, and symbolically powerful. And yet, even then, behind the carefully curated public image, stories began to leak. Stories of her closeness to Nehru, an intimacy captured in fleeting glances and private letters. The British press never dared to confirm it, but the rumors swirled like monsoon winds. Still, she kept her poise. She visited leper colonies, war-torn hospitals, and refugee camps, often without guards or fanfare. The public saw a noblewoman transformed, less a socialite, more a humanitarian. And when India finally gained independence, it was Edwina Mountbatten, not her husband, who left behind a lasting emotional imprint. In Indian villages, they remembered her not as Vicereine, but as Lady Edwina G, a figure of unexpected empathy from the ruling class. After India, she didn't return to idle aristocracy. Instead, she joined the St. John Ambulance Brigade, threw herself into relief work in war-torn Asia, and rejected the conventions of high society. She was seen less in ballrooms and more in disaster zones, comforting children in bomb shelters, treating the sick in forgotten provinces. To many, she remained an enigma, a woman who dined with kings yet washed the feet of refugees. Some called it redemption, others called it reinvention. But the public still clung to the old portrait, Lady Edwina Mountbatten, the glamorous noblewoman, forever draped in silk and controversy. She moved through the palaces of Europe like a whispered rumor. A dazzling socialite, a Vicereine of India, a friend to kings and lovers to men in power. But when the curtains closed, so did the illusions. Lady Edwina Mountbatten had the world at her feet. Titles, jewels, and the admiration of empires. But she also had scars the public never saw. A broken marriage paraded as a partnership, an affair with a foreign leader that shook political thrones, and a private life that defied the rules of aristocracy. She died not in her mansion, but in a faraway land, alone, in the service of others. Her funeral was royal, but her life was anything but. Because Lady Edwina didn't live like a lady. She lived like a storm, loved fiercely, judged harshly, and remembered controversially. This is the untold story of Lady Edwina Mountbatten. Lady Edwina Mountbatten did not vanish into obscurity. She dissolved into contradiction. In the years following her death, her name was spoken in lowered tones at royal functions, debated in academic circles, and revered in forgotten corners of Asia, where her touch had once brought comfort. She left behind no memoir, no tell-all interview, no final broadcast. Only a trail of letters, fractured headlines, and quiet testimonials from the marginalized she chose to stand beside. She was mourned differently depending on who you asked. To the British establishment, she was a wayward noblewoman whose heart had outpaced her title. To India, she was a foreigner who dared to love without conquest. To her daughters, she was a mystery wrapped in elegance. To Nehru, she was perhaps the only soul who truly saw him, not as a prime minister, but as a man. History has never quite known what to do with Edwina Mountbatten. Too complex for sainthood, too human for scandal. And maybe that is her legacy. A woman who didn't fit, who didn't shrink, and who, despite every warning, refused to live a life written by others. In the end, she did not disappear. She became something harder to erase. A question, a whisper, a scar in the golden script of empire. Edwina Mountbatten did not evolve. She was sculpted, not by her own hands, but by the weight of dynasty, expectation, and desire for relevance in a world that never quite knew what to do with a woman like her. Her reinvention was not a singular act. It was a sequence of masks, each more dazzling than the last. First came the role of perfect wife, then the fearless hostess of the elite, then the vicereine of a dying empire, and finally the humanitarian, perhaps the only mask that came close to truth. In public, she carried herself with a confidence that looked effortless. Behind closed doors, that confidence was built like armor, forged by silence, hammered by criticism, polished with performance. Each time the press whispered about her affairs, she responded not with denial, but with presence. She would appear at galas with poise, smile through scandal, and donate generously to causes just days after fresh rumors hit the tabloids. It wasn't just damage control, it was narrative control. Louis Mountbatten, ever the political creature, understood the game. He didn't just tolerate Edwina's dalliances, he utilized them. Their modern marriage became a selling point in diplomatic circles. They were painted as a progressive couple, forward-thinking, emotionally mature. But the truth was murkier. Louis had his own affairs. Yes, but Edwina's were emotional, and that made them dangerous. Still, the Mountbattens remained a power couple, united less by intimacy and more by strategy. Together, they navigated the stormy waters of post-war Britain, colonial collapse, and royal proximity. But inside, Edwina was drifting further from the image she had perfected. India was the turning point, not because of the politics, but because of Nehru. Their bond wasn't just romantic, it was reflective. He saw in Edwina what others missed, a woman exhausted by pretense, aching for sincerity. And she saw in him a mirror of her own contradictions, powerful yet lonely, revered yet misunderstood. They exchanged letters, hundreds of them, some poetic, some political, all deeply personal. While their relationship was never officially confirmed, it was undeniable in its emotional intensity. To many in the British establishment, the bond was scandalous. To Edwina, it was salvation. But salvation came at a price. The British press began to circle like vultures, speculating about the Vicereine's indiscretions. Members of the royal family, though outwardly cordial, grew wary. Even Louis, though publicly tolerant, tightened the leash in private. Edwina was warned, repeatedly, not to embarrass the crown. She didn't flinch, but she did adjust. She leaned harder into her humanitarian work, not as a cover, but as a rebellion. She refused to be remembered solely as a lover or a lady. She joined relief missions, ran field hospitals, and slept in tents rather than palaces. She turned down royal banquets to serve food in refugee camps. She rebranded herself, not with a PR campaign, but with sweat and service. Her work with the St. John Ambulance Brigade became more than a title. It became her identity. She traveled through war zones, nursed the wounded during the Chinese Civil War, and worked in dangerous regions across Southeast Asia. The aristocracy called it eccentric. The press labeled it penance. But for Edwina, it was perhaps the first time she felt whole. In suffering, she found clarity. In others' pain, she saw her own reflected. She once told a friend, "In luxury, I was invisible. In service, I became real." But reinvention came with sacrifice. Her relationship with her daughters remained distant. Her presence in British high society waned. Invitations slowed. Rumors never did. And the love that gave her new life, her bond with Nehru, was never allowed to fully bloom. Politics, race, empire, they were all walls too high, even for passion. By the 1950s, Edwina Mountbatten was a paradox. She no longer belonged to the world of tiaras and ballroom dances, but neither did she fully escape it. She was too noble for the revolutionaries, too rebellious for the royals. Yet she pressed on, driven not by redemption, but by defiance. Even her appearance changed. Gone were the elaborate gowns and high society hairstyles. She wore uniforms, simple dresses, scarves. Her face, once adored on magazine covers, grew sharper, more tired, but more human. Those close to her noticed the transformation. She smiled less, but meant it more. She spoke less, but with weight. The performative sparkle dimmed, but a different light emerged. Quieter, steadier, earned. Her reinvention was never publicly crowned. There were no awards, no national tributes, but in refugee camps across Asia, in letters written by the sick and dying, her name lived on. Not as a Mountbatten, but as Edwina G., the noble woman who didn't just visit, but stayed. She had remade herself not to please, not to impress, but to feel alive. For most of the world, Edwina Mountbatten reached the pinnacle of influence in 1947, the year she stepped into India as its last vicereine. It was the final chapter of the British Empire's rule over the subcontinent, and the Mountbattens were tasked with delivering both order and grace to the exit. The British saw her as a diplomatic asset. The Indians saw her as something more, a contradiction in pearls. Unlike other colonial figures, Edwina didn't simply observe suffering, she stepped into it. She held orphaned babies, walked through riot zones, and met with local leaders without entourages or scripts. In Delhi, her presence was magnetic. Crowds gathered wherever she went, not for her title, but for the sense of empathy she radiated. She listened. She touched hands without gloves. She made the palace feel less like a fortress and more like a refuge. But while the public admired her grace, the machinery of power turned slowly against her. British officials whispered about her emotional volatility. Some accused her of crossing lines, not just diplomatically, but morally. Her proximity to Nehru had become undeniable. Their every meeting was documented, their every glance dissected. Behind the walls of power, tensions rose. Louis Mountbatten, though outwardly composed, felt the pressure. His reputation was tied to hers. The crown grew increasingly wary. At one point, private messages were sent, advising Edwina to consider the optics of her associations. She ignored them. Because in Nehru she had found more than comfort. She had found a kind of truth. Their relationship, though never publicly consummated, was deeply personal. Letters between them, later uncovered, revealed a tenderness untainted by political maneuvering. Nehru wrote of missing her presence like a limb lost. Edwina responded with warmth, longing, and a deep sadness that they could never fully belong to each other. It was the kind of love that elevated the soul, but also caged it. When the partition of India led to one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history, Edwina threw herself into relief work with a fury that alarmed even her aides. She barely slept. She skipped meals. She ignored security protocols. She moved through refugee camps and burned villages with an urgency that bordered on self-destruction. She coordinated medical relief, arranged mass vaccinations, and negotiated safe passages between warring communities. The same woman once labeled a social butterfly now ran emergency operations like a seasoned general. But the cost was steep. She lost weight rapidly. Her immune system weakened. She suffered from exhaustion, migraines, and at least 2 fainting spells that were hidden from the press. Louis begged her to slow down. Nehru, too, wrote with concern. She smiled in response, but her eyes grew dimmer. By the early 1950s, her face had changed. Gone was the youthful glow that once lit up drawing rooms. In its place, fine lines carved by grief and insomnia. She had achieved global recognition, yes, but also found herself increasingly alone. Her marriage, while still intact in form, was a ghost of its former self. Conversations with Louis were cordial but brief. Their daughters had grown up, distant and shaped by different versions of the same mother. The aristocracy no longer knew what to make of her. Too radical for the drawing room, too aristocratic for the revolution, she had become an outsider to every world she once belonged to. Still, she pushed on. In 1956, she traveled to North Borneo on a humanitarian mission with St. John Ambulance. It was routine, or so she thought. One night, after a long day visiting medical clinics and sleeping in heat-ridden tents, Edwina retired to her room feeling unwell. She never woke up. A cerebral hemorrhage took her quickly and silently. In a foreign land, surrounded not by royalty, but by field workers and nurses. She was 55. The British government scrambled. Her body was flown back with full honors. A state funeral was arranged at sea, as per her wishes, with Prince Philip in attendance. The newspapers ran nostalgic headlines. Vicereine of Compassion, Lady of Two Worlds. But behind the tributes there was confusion. Who had she really been? The socialite? The scandal? The savior? Nehru was inconsolable. He arranged for Indian roses to be placed at her memorial. He refused interviews. At her funeral, his personal letter was placed with her belongings, a message no one was allowed to read. In death, she became what she never was in life, silent. But silence was not peace. The legacy she left behind was fractured. Admirers called her a pioneer of emotional diplomacy. Critics accused her of imperial sentimentality. Feminists debated her independence. Royalists debated her defiance. But one truth lingered. She had given her body, her love, her soul to causes greater than herself, and was rarely thanked for it. At her peak, she was adored. But the price she paid was never fully known. Only those who looked beyond the pearls and photographs saw the toll. The longing, the restlessness, the burning need to matter. And in the end, perhaps she did.